They called her the quiet one. That was the only thing anyone remembered about Natalie Hayes by the end of her third year at Mercy General: competent, reliable, invisible. Nobody asked her name twice. Nobody asked where she came from. Nobody asked why her hand sometimes trembled during routine for starts, or why she always knew exactly where the exit doors were, even in rooms she'd never entered before. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was a choice she'd made 3 years ago when she walked through these fluorescent corridors for the first time, trading one kind of silence for another. The kind that didn't require explanations. The San Diego night shift started at 10 o'clock, when the administrative staff left and the real work began. Natalie arrived early, as she always did, her sneaker silent against the polished linoleum of Mercy General's East Wing. The smell hit her first, that particular blend of antiseptic and human grief that she'd learned to breathe without flinching. It was 2 a.m. now, the hours when hospitals belong to the nurses and the dying, when the machines sang their mechanical lullabies and nobody asked questions about the woman checking vitals in room for 12. She moved through the corridors like someone who knew exactly where the exits were. Because she did. She always did. Her locker in the break room was a museum of the life she'd chosen not to live. A photograph of her son, Marcus, taken 2 years ago when he was 16 and still occasionally smiled at her. A stethoscope that had cost her $300 and was worth 10 times that. Compression gloves she wore on nights when her hands decided to remember things her brain was trying to forget. And at the bottom, folded carefully beneath her street clothes, a jacket she hadn't worn in 3 years. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, the collar frayed slightly at the edges. Inside the lining, sewn so carefully that only someone looking would find it, was a unit patch. The colors had faded from forest green to something closer to ash. Natalie touched it sometimes when she thought nobody was watching. She hadn't worn it. She couldn't. But she couldn't throw it away either. The tremor came without warning, the way it always did. She reached for the coffee pot in the break room at 2:44 a.m., and her left hand shook, just enough that she had to grip the mug with both palms to keep from spilling. 3 years of medication and therapy and breathing exercises, and it still happened. Her therapist called it hypervigilance. Natalie called it muscle memory. Her body remembered things her mind was trying to bury. Kandahar. The phi base. The 14 hours. She pressed her left hand against her scrubs, feeling the small circular scar on her shoulder through the fabric. A reminder that her body had been marked by things that left no paperwork, no discharge forms, no official record. Just a scar and a tremor and a woman who preferred coffee in silence. Marcus had noticed. Her son, who was 17 now and moving through the world like someone trying not to take up too much space, had asked exactly one question about why she came home some mornings with shadows under her eyes that coffee couldn't fix. She'd told him work was work. He'd accepted that. He was good at accepting things. He was good at respecting boundaries that she'd never explicitly drawn but that he seemed to understand existed. That was what broke her most, not the questions, but the absence of them. The way he'd learned to live around the parts of his mother that were locked away. The way she'd taught him that some doors in people's houses stay closed and you don't knock on them. His father had never understood that. Her ex-husband had wanted explanations, wanted her to be the person she was before, wanted to fix what he didn't understand couldn't be fixed, only managed. The divorce had been inevitable, written in the mathematics of two people trying to live in the same house when one of them had left part of herself on the other side of the world. She'd kept custody. She'd kept her son. She'd kept her silence. Everything else had been negotiable. Natalie moved through the vital signs checks with the kind of efficiency that came from having done this exact sequence 1,000 times. Room for 12, Mrs. Chen, post-op hip replacement, oxygen saturation 98%, blood pressure 122/80, heart rate steady. Room for 14, Mr. Dominguez, admitted with pneumonia, breathing easier than yesterday, lungs clearing. Room for 16, Mr. Torres, medication adjustment working better, color returning to his face. Her hands, when she knew what they were doing, were steady as surgical instruments. The tremor vanished when there was work to do. That was when her body remembered what it had been trained for: precision under pressure, muscle memory from 1,000 field insertions, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She didn't think about it. She just moved, checked, charted, and moved to the next room. The shift change happened at 6 in the morning, when the day staff arrived and the night people became invisible. That was when Dr. Hargrove usually did his administrative rounds, walking through his domain like a man inspecting a property he owned. His shoes were Italian, probably expensive. Natalie noticed things like that, the way privilege announced itself in small details. His tie was silk. His watch was the kind of thing that required an appointment to buy. He moved through the corridors the way some people move through airports, with the confidence of someone who'd never been lost, never questioned, never told no by anything that mattered. The board connections, she'd heard the other nurses mention, were impeccable. His brother-in-law was on the hospital's executive committee. His wife served on the foundation board. He was the kind of doctor who'd built a career on being untouchable, and everyone at Mercy General understood the architecture of that protection. He passed her in the hallway at 6:15, and she made sure to step aside, to avoid eye contact, to become the kind of presence that didn't require acknowledgement. She'd perfected this over 3 years, the art of being useful without being seen, competent without being memorable. Hargrove glanced at her the way he glanced at the supply cart, the way he glanced at the patient monitors. A quick assessment. Nothing worth his attention. She was exactly what she wanted to be in his line of sight, a competent but unremarkable night shift nurse. Someone whose name he'd never bother to learn. Someone whose efficiency was exactly the kind of thing that made him feel comfortable with his administrative role. The machines ran, the patients were monitored, everything functioned smoothly. He didn't need to know that the smoothness came from a woman who'd been trained to operate in combat conditions, who'd held the line at 5 base locations while mortar fire came in, who'd been decorated for things she'd never put on a resume. What happened next didn't require her to stay for day shift. That was the beauty of night work. The silence extended, the corridors emptied, and Natalie became a ghost again. But as she was walking toward the exit, badge in hand, her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. A text from Marcus, getting home late from school. Tutoring. Don't wait for me. She read it 3 times, the way she read everything, looking for what wasn't said. He was staying late. He didn't want her to worry. He was learning to navigate the world without her watching. He was becoming the kind of independent person she'd tried to raise. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt the familiar weight of the things she couldn't explain, the doors in her house that stayed closed, the reason she came home some mornings with shadows that couldn't be explained over breakfast. She was at her car in the parking lot when the radio crackled on the scanner. Someone had left tuned to the emergency channel, the open frequency that broadcasted calls to every unit monitoring the city. Incoming helicopter. Combat medevac. Kandahar. The words hit her like a physical thing. She stood with her hand on her car door, breathing through the reflex that wanted to turn her body back toward the hospital, that wanted to activate protocols that she'd trained 18 years to follow. 3 tours. 3 combat deployments. 47 field medical procedures she'd documented in reports nobody outside the command would ever read. She was retired now. She was a civilian. She was a nurse who checked vitals and took medication for PTSD and went home to a son who respected her silence. But something was coming. The radio crackled again. ETA 8 minutes. Critical blood loss. Shrapnel wounds. The team was standing by. She stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the parking lot, her hand on the car door, and made a decision that would change everything. She turned around. Her sneakers were silent on the asphalt as she walked back toward the entrance. The tremor in her left hand had stopped. The person who walked back through those doors at 6:32 in the morning was no longer the invisible night shift nurse. Something else had woken up. Something that remembered fire-based protocols and triage decisions and exactly what to do when soldiers started arriving by helicopter. The door slid open. The smell of antiseptic wrapped around her like a uniform she'd never taken off. Her hands were steady now. Perfectly steady. The kind of steady that comes from having done this 1,000 times before. And in the distance, growing louder with every second, came the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the San Diego dawn like thunder approaching from another world entirely. The Black Hawk's rotors shook the windows of the trauma bay as the medevac call came through, incoming from Kandahar, male, 32 years old, shrapnel wounds to the abdomen and right thigh, blood loss estimated at 2 liters already. The ER coordinator was already moving, calling out blood types to the lab, and Natalie heard her name before the full briefing finished. We need B negative. Who's got B negative on staff? The lab tech, Marcus, was shouting back, calling the donor pool now. ETA on units is 40 minutes minimum. Natalie set down her clipboard. B negative. Her blood type. The rarest of the rare, less than 2% of the population carried it. She'd known this her entire career, had donated 3 times already at Mercy General, quietly, never drawing attention. The ER coordinator saw her moving toward the phlebotomy station. Hayes. You're thinking what I'm thinking. I'm O-negative compatible, Natalie said, her voice perfectly level. But B-negative will take his body through post-op without complications. Call me in. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really an offer. It was the only option that made sense, and they both knew it. 20 minutes later, the needle was in her left arm, and she watched her blood drain into the collection bags, dark red, almost purple in the fluorescent light, flowing through the tubing with the steady pulse of the machine. 1 bag. 2 bags. 3. Pain was information. Her body was simply saying thank you to itself, the kind of thing she'd learned long ago, blood given was blood purpose served. The medevac touched down. The trauma team moved him through the bay like a choreographed dance, vitals shouted, orders confirmed, her blood already waiting in the rapid infuser. She could see him for maybe 3 seconds as they wheeled past, young, muscular, face pale with shock, left arm bearing the sleeve tattoo of Charlie Platoon. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen. Her son had mentioned him once in a letter home. His commanding officer. Good guy, he'd written. Steady under fire. She watched them move him toward Trauma 4, watched her blood begin its work, watched his color start coming back as the transfusion ran. But that wasn't the worst part. The general arrived 47 minutes later, and everything changed the moment he entered the trauma recovery unit. He was 6'3", silver-haired, the kind of presence that made the air pressure shift, uniform immaculate despite the early hour, rank insignia on his shoulders catching the fluorescent light. He moved directly to the recovery bed where his son was beginning to stabilize, and Natalie felt her breath catch in her chest. Because she recognized him. Not from any briefing or photograph. She recognized him from her son's eyes, that exact slate blue stare, that same controlled intensity. The general took his son's hand, leaned down, said something quiet that made Marcus's face relax. Dad, she heard him say. I'm okay. I'm okay. The general didn't release his hand. He stayed there for a long moment, breathing steadily, the kind of composed grief that only comes after a lifetime of bad news. Then he turned, and his eyes found Natalie where she was finishing the final vitals check. She kept her expression neutral, her movements precise. She'd been trained to disappear into a room for exactly this reason, to do the work and not be seen. She nodded to him, a small acknowledgement, a human gesture. She moved to his wife, who had followed him in, looking shaken. His vitals are stable. The blood transfusion resolved the acute anemia. He's going to need monitoring for the next 72 hours, but the prognosis is good. The general's wife reached out and touched Natalie's arm. Thank you, she said, and her voice was trembling. Thank you for being here. Natalie nodded again. She was about to excuse herself when the door opened and Dr. Hargrove appeared. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the general, his wife, the recovered soldier, and Natalie standing at the bedside looking like she belonged there. His expression changed. His jaw tightened. He stepped inside and forced a smile that looked like a shark's grin. General, he said, extending his hand. Dr. Harrison Hargrove, Unit Director. An absolute honor. Your son is stable and under the best possible care. The general shook his hand briefly, turned back to his son. Hargrove's smile froze. He waited maybe 10 seconds, then turned his attention to Natalie. His voice was perfectly calm. Perfectly controlled. Nurse Hayes. A word. Actually, no, we'll address this now. He turned back to the general and his wife with an expression of profound concern. I apologize in advance for what I'm about to discuss, but patient confidentiality and professional boundaries are sacred in our institution. This staff member seems to have confused medical care with social engagement. Natalie felt every muscle in her body locked down. She'd learned this discipline 20 years ago, the moment before an IED detonation, the second before incoming fire, the instant when survival meant becoming stone. She took one measured breath. Her face remained perfectly still. I was answering a question about post-operative pain management, doctor. The patient's wife asked if there would be complications with the transfusion. Hargrove's smile widened. You were establishing a relationship. There's a difference between competent nursing and playing hero because you happen to have the right blood type. Don't mistake a biological coincidence for significance. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator humming. The general's wife looked uncomfortable. The general himself had gone very still. Hargrove continued, his voice smooth as silk. Mercy General maintains strict professional boundaries with VIP families. It's hospital policy. Perhaps that wasn't emphasized at wherever you trained. Natalie's eyes didn't flicker. One tear escaped from her left eye, not from emotion, but from the pure physiological pressure of holding herself together, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Her voice was steady. Quiet. A voice that had given orders under mortar fire. I've bled for people I've never met. I won't apologize for caring about those I have. She turned and walked out of the room before Hargrove could respond, her movements precise, her head level. Behind her, she heard the general say, Doctor, the young woman just saved my son's life. I'd suggest you recalibrate your management style. But by then she was already in the hallway, already disappearing into the machinery of the hospital like she'd learned to disappear into desert landscapes, mountains, the spaces between surveillance and safe houses. She went back to her locker, sat on the bench, and let herself breathe. The break room the next day smelled like stale coffee and the chemical lemon of the cleaning solution they used on the floors every evening. Natalie had timed her lunch for exactly 2:10 in the afternoon, when the day shift was deep in charting and the night shift hadn't arrived yet. The room should have been empty. It should have been quiet. She set her lunch down, a salad she'd made that morning, protein and greens and nothing that required conversation, and was pulling out a chair when the conversation died. 3 nurses at the table across the room, 2 of them with half-full plates, 1 of them mid-bite. They looked at her. They looked at each other. They began gathering their food. One of them, Jennifer from post-op, actually said it out loud, drama, loud enough to be heard but not loud enough to be addressed directly. They left within 30 seconds. The silence they left behind was like a physical presence, like the absence of oxygen. Natalie sat alone with her salad and the sound of the refrigerator humming, and she understood something she'd been trying not to understand: isolation had begun. It was textbook social warfare, the kind of thing that happened in hospitals and military units and anywhere humans congregated in hierarchical structures. You were marked as a problem, and then the problem became contagious. No one wanted to be seen eating lunch with you. By Friday, she understood how carefully Hargrove had orchestrated it. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 7 in the morning, a printed memo posted where all 32 nurses on the surgical floor would see it during shift change. Unauthorized patient familiarity. Failure to maintain professional distance with VIP families. Written warning, to be placed in personnel file. Her name was listed in clinical red text. Other names were mentioned, the resident, the other nurses who'd been in the room, but there was enough ambiguity that it felt like she was the primary target. And that was the genius of it. He hadn't fired her. He hadn't made false accusations that she could formally dispute. He'd simply documented a subjective interpretation of what everyone had witnessed and made it official. Natalie stood in front of the board during her shift break, reading her own name in administrative language, aware that 7 other staff members were watching from the nurse's station. The fluorescent light hummed above her head. She felt their eyes on her back. She read the words carefully, committing them to memory, understanding that this was Act 2 of a much longer play. Then she turned around, caught Hargrove's gaze from his office. He was watching her through the glass partition, and he smiled when she looked at him. It was the smile of a man who had just won something. It was the smile of someone who believed she would break. She didn't smile back. She simply turned and walked to her assignment, picked up the chart for Trauma 3, and began her work. The treacherous thing about competence was that it meant you still had to show up and do your job perfectly even when the environment was designed to destroy you. Even when every colleague treated you like a ghost. Even when your director was watching, waiting for you to fail in some measurable way that would justify her removal from this place she'd spent 3 years trying to make her home. And that's when the phone in the ER coordinator's office began ringing with incoming calls that would change everything. The phone calls started coming in at 2:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 14 days after the write-up appeared on the unit board. Natalie didn't answer them. She was in the medication room on the 3rd floor, counting controlled substances with the precision of someone trained to account for every round, every bullet, every life. The ER coordinator's voice crackled through the overhead. Incoming helicopter, medical priority, trauma alert. She didn't look up. She signed the log, locked the cabinet, and returned to her cart as if the announcement meant nothing to her anymore. That had been her strategy for 2 weeks, mean nothing to everyone. She took assignments without comment. She ate lunch in her Subaru in the parking lot, watching rain streak the windshield, watching nurses from her unit walk past without acknowledgement. One of them had looked directly at her yesterday and still managed not to see her. That was the real pain. Not the words. Not the write-up. The invisibility that came after, the kind that was earned through survival, the kind that said, "You've already proven you're not worth knowing." Her son Marcus had noticed the difference. 16, dark eyes that looked too much like his father's. He'd asked her Wednesday night while she was microwaving dinner, "You okay, Mom? You're quieter than usual." She'd paused with her hand on the microwave door. Quieter than usual was what she'd trained for, what she'd practiced for 3 years. Quieter than usual was the whole point. Work has been demanding, she'd said, and that was true enough. Demanding in the way that all small wars were demanding, the kind where nobody fired shots but everybody bled anyway. "You sure?" He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his backpack still on, waiting for permission to stop worrying about her. "I'm sure. Go do your homework." He'd left. She'd finished microwaving. She'd eaten standing at the sink. And somewhere in that routine, something had shifted in her hands. They'd stopped shaking. It happened during a routine medication round on Friday morning, a 73-year-old cardiac patient, digoxin and metoprolol, standard dosing, standard vitals check. Natalie had approached the bed like she'd approached 1,000 other beds, quietly, competently, without drawing attention. She'd reached for the pill cup and felt it. The absence of tremor. The steadiness returning. Her fingers moved across the patient's wrist to check his radial pulse, and they moved the way they used to move, on their own, without thought, without apology. Muscle memory waking up. The part of her brain that had lived in Kandahar field hospitals, that had counted ribs under her fingers and found arteries in the dark, that part was coming back online. She didn't fight it. Fighting it was what had kept her trembling for 3 years. Accepting it was what made her dangerous. By Monday, she was ready for something without knowing what that something was. The general arrived at 3:15 p.m. for his routine follow-up, the kind of standard appointment that hospitals ran every day, post-discharge check, vitals, clearance to return to duty. Natalie wasn't assigned to his care. She was supposed to be restocking the supply room. But when the ER coordinator called out the vitals for room 4, nobody moved fast enough, and she found herself walking past anyway. She told herself she was checking on the blood pressure cuff. That wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. He was alone in the exam room when she glanced through the window. His color was wrong. Not dramatically, not the sudden gray of cardiac arrest, but subtly, insidiously wrong. The kind of wrong that took 3 years of civilian nursing to miss, but only 3 seconds of combat experience to recognize. His skin had taken on a faint blue-gray quality at the fingertips, the edges. His breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort. He sat on the exam table in a hospital gown and looked like a fortress beginning to collapse from the inside. She didn't knock. She stepped into the room and closed the door. How long? Her voice was different now. Flat. Clinical. Absent the apologies that had become her uniform. He looked up. I'm sorry, are you? How long has your breathing been like this? Since last night. I thought it was nothing. Post-operative inflammation, maybe. The cardiologist scheduled me for today. He shifted on the table and winced, as if the movement was pulling something tight inside his chest. Natalie moved closer. She could see it now, the signs stacking like cards in a house built on sand. His neck veins were distended, bulging against the sides of his throat like they were fighting against pressure. His voice was weaker than it had been 2 weeks ago, the deep command gone thin. Sir, I need you to lie back. Slowly. He obeyed without question. That was the thing about real authority, it didn't need to justify itself. She placed her hands on his chest, just below the collarbone, feeling the vibration of his heartbeat. It was there but thready, the rhythm struggling. Her fingers found the intercostal spaces, first, second, third, counting down the ribs the way she'd learned in a tent outside Kandahar while artillery walked toward them across the desert. She pressed gently at the subxiphoid area, below the breastbone where his abdomen met his torso, and felt it. The fluid. The pressure. The way his heart was drowning while he sat in a San Diego hospital wearing a gown. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, the sac around his heart, had filled with fluid. The post-operative bleeding had been slower than any surgeon would have predicted, creeping in day by day, building pressure that compressed the heart, restricted the chambers, choked off the circulation. He'd been living on borrowed time since the night he left the OR, and now his borrowed time was being recalled. I need to get the crash cart, she said. Don't move. Don't talk. Stay exactly like this. She was gone for 8 seconds. The crash cart was 3 rooms away. She moved like a woman who had never been invited to slow down, who understood that every second was a second someone could use to die. Her hands opened drawers without hesitation, reaching past the standard surgical kits, because a standard surgical kit would take too long. Pericardiocentesis needed precision, and precision needed equipment that she suddenly needed to improvise. 20-gauge spinal needle. Check. Betadine swabs. Check. A syringe from the crash cart supplies, not the sterile kits, no time. She grabbed what she could with one hand and moved back to the room, shutting the door with her hip. The general's skin was darker now. The blue-gray had moved inward, creeping across his face like a tide. His voice, when he tried to speak, came out as a rasp. What's happening to me? Fluid around your heart. I'm going to remove it. She positioned him supine, his arms at his sides, and found the angle in her mind first before her hands moved. Subxiphoid approach. Just below the xiphoid process, the small bone at the base of the sternum. Her left hand counted ribs. Her right hand was already holding the needle, already positioned. She didn't ask for permission because permission was something civilians asked for, and she was not civilian anymore. Sir, I need you to stay still. Breathe slowly. This will be cold. She swept the betadine across his lower chest in a 3-inch square, and the smell of it transported her, not to memory but to presence. Kandahar, 2013. Phi Base supporting Delta operations. Mortar rounds walking across the compound. A lieutenant colonel with shrapnel in his femoral artery, bleeding out on a stretcher, and her with a tourniquet and 30 seconds to decide if she believed in her own training. She believed. She'd always believed. She just hadn't let herself act on that belief in 3 years. The needle advanced through skin, through subcutaneous tissue, angling slightly toward the left shoulder the way anatomy dictated. She felt the pop, the definitive shift as the needle penetrated the pericardial membrane, and immediately drew back the plunger of the syringe. The flash came instantly. Blood-tinged fluid, the color of rust in water, the color of pressure, the color of borrowed time running out. She aspirated in steady draws. 40 milliliters. 60. The general gasped, and she could hear his lungs opening, his airways drawing in oxygen like they'd been starving for it. 80 milliliters. His neck veins began to decompress visibly, the bulging softening as the pressure inside his chest decreased, as his heart found room to beat again. 90 milliliters and his color was changing back, the blue-gray retreating, consciousness returning to his eyes. She withdrew the needle, applied pressure with a gauze pad, and kept one hand on his chest to monitor the response. His heart rate steadied. His breathing deepened. And the code team burst through the door exactly as his eyes opened, exactly as he took a full breath, exactly as he began to live again instead of slowly asphyxiate in plain sight. Natalie stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. She delivered the report in clipped medical cadence, the kind that left no room for questions. 4-star general, postoperative cardiac tamponade, pericardial effusion approximately 90 milliliters. Emergent pericardiocentesis performed, needle aspiration completed, patient responsive and breathing. Vitals are normalizing. One of the code team nurses stared at her, mouth open. Another looked at the crash cart, then at the general, then back at Natalie. How did you? The door opened again. Dr. Hargrove stepped through, still wearing his donor luncheon blazer, still radiating the confidence of a man who had never been corrected by reality. His eyes went to the general first, good, improvement, the kind of thing that reflected well on whoever happened to be in charge. Then his eyes went to the crash cart. To the unsterilized needle kit scattered across the surgical tray. To the betadine stains on the gauze. To Natalie, standing with her gloves still on, betadine on her wrists, a single drop of the general's blood on her sleeve. His face went white first. Then it went red the way certain men go red when they realize the world has shifted beneath them and they're standing on the wrong side of the line. What the hell, he said, and his voice had lost its authority, replaced by something sharper and more desperate. Did you just do? The general's face had gone the color of slate. His lips were parted, jaw clenching and releasing like he was trying to find oxygen that wasn't there. His hand clawed at his chest, and Natalie saw it before anyone else did, the telltale sign of cardiac tamponade. The way his breath came in short, desperate gasps. The way his veins were distending in his neck like blue cables about to snap. She moved. No hesitation. No chain of command. No call button to wait for a resident who'd arrive in 3 minutes and be dead wrong. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart, yanking open the drawers with the steady precision of someone operating in combat mode. 16 years of Kandahar muscle memory didn't ask permission. It just worked. Cardiac tamponade, she said to the monitor tech standing frozen by the door. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now. She didn't wait for him to move. She was already pulling supplies, finding what she needed, improvising what she couldn't. The crash cart had no pericardiocentesis kit. Most ER crash carts didn't. But Natalie had done this before in a sandstorm with shrapnel falling like rain and a marine bleeding out beneath her hands. She took what she had, a needle, a syringe, sterile field approximation because there was no time for perfect. The general's O2 sat was dropping. 91, 87. 84, his blood pressure had cratered to 68/42. She positioned him back against the bed, found the angle between his ribs, the space where the pericardium held fluid like a fist around his failing heart. Her hands moved on their own. Pain was information. Pressure was data. Everything else was noise. The needle went in with surgical precision. 60-degree angle. Steady. No tremor. No hesitation. And then the hiss of air escaping. Fluid came back into the syringe. Dark red. Pressure relief. The pericardium releasing its stranglehold on his heart like a fist unclenching. His oxygen saturation climbed. 85, 89. 92, his blood pressure steadied. His breathing eased into something that looked like survival. For minutes. That was all it took to pull someone back from the edge of a cliff. Natalie stepped back just as the trauma team surged in, responding to the overhead page. She was still holding the needle kit when Hargrove arrived. Not running. Walking. Deliberate. The way a man walks when he's been called away from something important, a donor luncheon, probably, somewhere downtown where he could talk about his hospital's reputation and his board connections and the importance of maintaining institutional standards. He stopped when he saw her. He saw the crash cart pulled open. He saw the general lying back against the bed with oxygen flowing and a monitor showing a rhythm that was stable, that was living. He saw the needle in Natalie's hand. The syringe with blood in it. The improvised field kit that looked like something from a battlefield rather than a hospital, because that was exactly what it was. His face went through a series of expressions. Confusion. Recognition. Rage. The kind of rage that comes from understanding that you've been outmaneuvered by someone you'd already decided was beneath you. What the hell did you just do? His voice had lost its authority, replaced by something sharper and more desperate, the sound of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. He stepped toward her, and she could smell the expensive cologne mixing with whatever fancy lunch had been served. That needle. That kit. What procedures have you been performing without authorization? Natalie set the syringe down with the kind of care a sniper uses when setting down a rifle. She didn't look at him. She was already opening her mind back to civilian compartments, already translating what her hands had just done into the language Hargrove would understand, though he'd never believe it. The general was in cardiac tamponade, she said. Her voice was steady. He needed pericardiocentesis. It's done. Out of my room. Not a question. A command delivered with a kind of shaking fury that only comes when a man's authority has been questioned in front of witnesses. The code team was still there, watching. The monitor tech. A resident who'd just arrived and was now taking in the scene with dawning understanding. Security. Get her out. But before security could move, Hargrove turned to the code team leader, his voice dropping into something glacial and controlled. Document everything. Every procedure she performed. Every unauthorized touch. I want a full investigation report on my desk before shift change. He was already pulling his phone out, already walking toward the door with the purposeful stride of someone who understood that the only way to fix this was to make it bigger, to make it institutional, to weaponize the system itself. By the time Natalie had reached her locker, Hargrove was in his office. She didn't know it yet. She was changing out of her scrubs, moving on autopilot, when her phone buzzed with a message from HR, "You are required to report to the Human Resources Department immediately regarding a personnel matter. Security escort will be provided to your locker." The general, she would later learn, had been stabilized and transferred to ICU. The cardiothoracic surgeon had arrived within the hour and confirmed what Natalie already knew: the fluid in his pericardium would have killed him inside 10 minutes if left untouched. Her 4-minute window had been the difference between life and death. The surgery team had actually used her procedure as the intervention point. Saved the general's life twice, once in the exam room, once on the operating table. But that wasn't what Hargrove was calling to report. The board president received his call at 2:27 p.m., just after lunch. Hargrove's voice was controlled, professional, the voice of a man protecting his institution. "We have a nurse on our trauma unit who performed an unauthorized invasive procedure with improvised equipment on a 4-star general. The liability exposure is catastrophic. I'm bringing in an external investigator." By 3:15 p.m., he was making other calls. Mercy General had hired Natalie 3 years ago from a facility in Portland. Before that, a hospital in Seattle. He called both, asking the same pointed questions. Did you ever notice unusual training? Did she ever mention surgical procedures? Was there any gap in her employment history you couldn't account for? By 4:06 p.m., an external investigator from a medical review firm was being briefed in Hargrove's office. The investigator was thorough, professional, the kind of man who made his living protecting institutions from liability. He'd looked through Natalie's file, her nursing credentials checked out, her licenses were valid, her continuing education was current. But there was no record of surgical training. No mention of pericardiocentesis. No documentation of advanced trauma procedures. Where did she learn this? The investigator had asked, frowning at the gap between her nursing credentials and her performance in the exam room. Hargrove had leaned forward. That's what I want to know. Her employment history is clean, but there's an 8-year gap between her time in Seattle and when she applied here. She doesn't volunteer that information. I suspect she's fabricated portions of her background. By 5:13 p.m., Natalie was being called into HR. The director, a woman named Carol with nervous eyes and a HR department script in front of her, read from the paper with the kind of careful distance that meant she'd been coached on exact wording. Pending a full investigation into unauthorized medical procedures and credential verification, you are suspended from duty without pay, effective immediately. We'll need your badge and access card. Security appeared at the HR office door. Not hostile. Just present. Natalie stood, nodded once, and walked to her locker with a security officer beside her. The day shift was still working. She could see them as she moved through the corridors, nurses at the station, residents at the med dispenser, attendings reviewing charts. They watched her pass. No one acknowledged her. No one made eye contact. Her jacket was still in her locker from the morning shift, the one with the faded unit patch sewn deep into the lining, underneath the inner pocket where no one would ever think to look. She pulled it on, and the security officer escorted her past the break room, past the unit board that still displayed her written warning in capital letters for everyone to read, past the entrance to the surgical wing where the general was already in recovery. The parking lot was getting dark. Rain had started somewhere mid-afternoon, and now it was hammering the asphalt like applause from a crowd that would never stop. Natalie stood in it for a moment, letting the drops soak into her hair, into her clothes, water streaming down her face. The security officer waited by the door, uncomfortable but determined. "You can go home now," she said quietly. She drove to her house in National City and sat at her kitchen table with the suspension papers spread out before her like a crime scene. Liability. Credential verification. Unauthorized procedures. Investigation pending. The words blurred together into something that felt like drowning. The faded unit patch was in her jacket pocket now, worn fabric with gold threading that had tarnished decades ago. She held it in her shaking hand, staring at the eagle and anchor that represented 18 years of her life. 18 years she'd been trying to bury. 18 years she thought she'd escaped. Her son came home at 6:36 p.m., 3 hours early from school, his backpack still on his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. Her eyes were red. There were fresh tears on her face. She was holding something small and worn in her trembling hand, and she was staring at it like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Mom, what happened? Why are you home?" She couldn't answer him. Couldn't explain why the job that was supposed to be her healing had become her unraveling. Couldn't find the words to tell her son that everything she'd built in the last 3 years, the anonymity, the quiet, the chance to be just a nurse and nothing more, had collapsed in 4 minutes because she couldn't stop being what she'd always been. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. By evening, the termination papers were signed, dated, and spread across her kitchen table like autopsy results. Natalie sat motionless in the dark, her badge, stripped and confiscated at 4:06 p.m., absent from her neck for the first time in 3 years. The silence of the house pressed against her like water. Rain hammered the windows in irregular bursts, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. She held the faded unit patch from her old Special Forces jacket in both hands, the embroidered insignia worn soft from decades of her fingers finding it during impossible moments. Kandahar Phi Base. 14 hours holding the line while mortars shook the earth. The patch remembered when she was strong. Now her hands shook as tears fell onto the creased fabric, each one a betrayal of the composure she'd spent 3 years perfecting. The suspension letter was merciless, unauthorized emergency procedure. Failure to maintain sterile protocol. Endangering patient safety through reckless intervention. Every word a deliberate reframing. Every sentence Hargrove's handwriting disguised as institutional policy. She'd saved a 4-star general's life in 4 minutes. The hospital was calling it a crime. Security had walked her out through the main corridor at 4:52 p.m. Badge gone. Credentials revoked. Access terminated. The day shift nurses had watched from their stations, some averting their eyes, others staring with the particular satisfaction of people relieved the target wasn't them. One of them, Jennifer, who'd shared lunches with Natalie 6 months ago before Hargrove's write-up poisoned the well, looked away so deliberately it felt like a second slap. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to help. The sound of her shoes on the tile was the loudest thing in the hallway. Now it was 9:43 p.m. and she was still holding the patch. Her son came through the front door at 9:02 p.m., 3 hours early from his shift at the restaurant, moving through the dark house with the certainty of someone who knew something was wrong before he saw anything. He found her at the table, papers everywhere, the patch still clutched between her palms like prayer beads. He didn't turn on the lights. Mom. She couldn't explain. The words existed in a language she'd been trained to speak before she became a nurse, before she became a version of herself that was smaller and safer and silent. She opened her mouth and nothing came out but a breath that broke in the middle. He sat down beside her without asking questions. He was 17 and wise in the way children become when one parent carries invisible weight. He'd noticed the nightmares. The way she'd flinch at helicopter sounds. The scar tissue on her ribs that didn't match any accident she'd ever mentioned. He'd learned not to ask, but he'd always known she was carrying something that was never supposed to be set down. I got fired, she finally said. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across San Diego like distant ordnance. For what? For saving someone's life. She looked at him then, and he saw, really saw, the wreckage. Not the composed trauma nurse in scrubs. The soldier underneath, the one who'd learned the hard way that healing other people sometimes meant breaking yourself. I broke protocol. It worked. That's apparently the same as being dangerous. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He was smart enough to know when comfort was a lie. Instead, he reached for the unit patch and held it alongside her. The next morning, she was called to the hospital board hearing at 8:15 a.m. Administration conference room on the executive floor. She'd expected to sit alone while they finalized her termination. Instead, her son appeared at the conference room doors at 8:41 a.m., pushing through with a shadow box clutched against his chest like an artifact that could change time itself. My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, he said to the silent room. They need to see these. He set the shadow box on the polished mahogany table. The room collapsed inward. For board members. An FBI investigator. Hospital legal counsel. Dr. Hargrove in a pressed suit and polished shoes, the picture of concerned administrative authority. And the general, who'd been there since 8:51 a.m., observing. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is an eternity in silence. Inside the shadow box, a navy cross. 2 silver stars. The Purple Heart. The Purple Heart again. Medals that turned a night shift nurse into a legend. Medals that reframed every moment of her clinical competence as something far more dangerous than Hargrove's narrative allowed. A nurse on the panel, not one who'd abandoned her in the break room, but someone new enough to the institution to still believe in merit, opened the sealed military file with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she read aloud, 18 years of active service. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. 47 confirmed lives saved under direct fire. Kandahar Fire Base, 2011. 14 hours holding the perimeter while medics rotated through her care stations. Training Protocol for Combat Field Medicine, 2012 to 2014. Cited as most effective field trauma instructor in the Special Operations Command Medical Division. Each fact was a weapon placed on the table. Each were dismantled Hargrove's case piece by piece. The general stood. His voice was quiet and carried the kind of weight that made the room's air pressure change. I'm General Marcus Webb. My son was the combat medic brought in 3 weeks ago from Kandahar. Senior Chief Hayes didn't just donate blood to my son, she was the chief who held the line at Kandahar Fire Base for 14 hours in 2011. She trained half the medics who kept my son alive in Helmand Province. She saved my life 4 days ago using emergency medicine that every military medical officer recognized as textbook combat casualty care. He named each decoration. Bronze Star. Silver Star. He paused. The room held its breath. Silver Star. Another pause, longer this time. Navy Cross. Silence like a held breath before detonation. That's the officer you're firing. The FBI investigator, who'd been reviewing the case with professional neutrality, cleared his throat. His expression shifted from administrative procedure to something colder, sharper. I need to pause these proceedings. He turned his laptop toward the board. When Dr. Hargrove requested this background investigation, he provided what he claimed were discrepancies in Senior Chief Hayes' service record. Dates that didn't align. Deployments that seemed inconsistent. I submitted those alleged discrepancies to the military database for verification. He paused deliberately. The database shows no such discrepancies. In fact, someone attempted to alter her official service record in the military personnel system 2 days ago. Using administrative credentials. He turned to his phone. The login traces to this hospital's network. Specifically, to Dr. Hargrove's office computer. The timestamp matches a gap in his calendar during a donor luncheon that day. Someone was actively attempting to falsify federal military records. Hargrove stood abruptly. That's absurd. I never? The credentials are yours, Doctor. The investigator's voice was scalpel sharp. Your username. Your password hash. Your office IP address. That's a federal felony. Falsifying government documents. Tampering with military personnel files. The board president leaned forward, her expression hardening into something that looked like contempt. You tried to forge a decorated veteran's military record to justify a termination. Hargrove's composure cracked like porcelain. The mask of institutional authority dissolved. What remained was desperation and rage. I was trying to protect this hospital. She performed an unauthorized procedure. She's unstable, she's dangerous, she's been hiding her military background for a reason. The general's voice cut through like a command. She's standing right there. Address her directly. Hargrove turned toward Natalie, and whatever he saw in her face, not anger, not fear, but the absolute stillness of someone who'd learned to kill with the precision of a surgeon, made him back toward the wall instead. His voice rose. This is a misunderstanding. I have connections on this board. I know the hospital president. I have relationships. 2 FBI agents entered the conference room from a side door. They'd been waiting outside for exactly this moment. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the lead agent, said, "We need to take you into custody. Falsifying federal military records carries a sentence of up to 10 years. The handcuffs clicked with the sound of career ending. Hargrove backed further, his voice fracturing. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The liability exposure. She violated protocol, she. You violated federal law, the agent said flatly. That supersedes hospital policy. Security escorted him through the administrative wing. Past offices where staff stopped mid-conversation to watch. Past the nurses' station where 3 nurses who'd abandoned Natalie in the break room stared in shock. Past the unit board where her write-up still hung, that single laminated warning that had transformed her overnight from colleague to pariah. One of the agents paused to remove it from the board, handed it directly to Natalie. "You'll want this for your lawsuit." She held it without looking down. Her voice was steady, unbreakable. "I don't need it." The agent nodded like that was the exact right answer. By noon, the hospital had released an official statement: Dr. Hargrove terminated for cause. Federal investigation active. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes reinstated with full back pay, formal apology, and, the board president added with visible fury at being forced to clean up his wreckage, a position as director of Mercy General's new Combat Trauma Recovery Program. Specialized Unit. VA Funding Partnership. Board grant approved unanimously while Hargrove's handcuffs were still warm. That evening, Natalie sat in her car in the parking lot with her son beside her. The write-up was torn in half on the dashboard. For the first time in 3 years, she let herself breathe like someone who'd survived the impossible and lived to see the other side. 2 years later, the General made a personal visit to Mercy General's Combat Trauma Recovery Program. The hallways had changed. Photos of active-duty medical personnel lined the walls now, men and women who'd worn the same uniform she had, who understood that healing sometimes required someone who'd already seen the worst. The break room had a support group for veterans-turned-nurses meeting twice weekly. The unit had expanded to 12 full-time staff, all of them veterans, all of them trained by someone who remembered what it meant to save lives when everything was burning. He found Chief Natalie Hayes in her office. She was wearing scrubs now with her rank insignia embroidered on the pocket, no longer hiding who she was. Her son was studying trauma surgery at UCSD, already volunteering in her program, understanding finally why his mother had needed to keep her strength so carefully guarded. The General presented her with a commendation from the Secretary of Defense for her work bridging military and civilian medical trauma care. They stood at her office window, looking down at the parking lot across the street. Both of them paused. Dr. Hargrove was visible at a folding table under a pop-up tent, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo faded from sun exposure. His medical license was revoked. His board connections had evaporated the moment those handcuffs went on. He was handing supplemental insurance flyers to people who walked past without stopping, his presence so diminished that even the indifferent pedestrian seemed to move through him like wind. "Does it feel like justice?" the General asked. She considered the question with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned the difference between winning and surviving. She thought about the medics she'd hired who'd been told their trauma made them unemployable. The combat nurses she'd trained who now understood that the damage you carry can become the strength you teach. She picked up the faded unit patch from her desk. She kept it there now, visible and honored, and held it for a moment before setting it back down. "Justice is just the scoreboard, General. This program is the legacy." He nodded, understanding completely. As he moved toward the door, he paused. "They taught us a saying in selection: true class is what you do when the lights go out." She smiled then, the first uncomplicated smile she'd allowed herself in years, and said, "Then I hope I showed some." Below them, Hargrove packed his folding table as the sun descended toward the Pacific, alone and invisible, while inside Mercy General, Chief Hayes began her evening rounds, training the next generation of soldiers turned healers, her strength finally visible, finally honored, finally home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to see it. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the most strength. Thanks for being here.